This time on Poll Hub, one of the biggest changes in America over the last 50 years has been the role of women in the workplace. It may be hard to imagine a world in which women were secretaries or teachers, but not CEOs, doctors, or lawyers, let alone women as soldiers or FBI agents and airline pilots. A lot has changed, but for all of this change, there are some stubborn acts of sexism at home. We're going to talk about that. Then, increasingly few Americans remember a time when young men were drafted into the military. So when the news broke that starting later this year, Americans will be automatically registered in the Selective Service system, one of the more common reactions was, that's still around? Finally, the fun fact, it's perfect for these dog days of summer and gets us back to an era before air conditioning. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffith.
And I'm Lee Maringoff.
Well, we begin today with a topic that I can't believe we're still talking about, but we are, and that is women at work. Today, women make up nearly half of the workforce and hold a growing majority of managerial roles. Women certainly have come a long way, but the debate over quote-unquote a woman's place persists in culture, including the rise of the trad wife subculture. So let's begin with a little bit of a reality check here with some data. According to Pew Research Center data from 2024, 76% of Americans say women are doing better at getting leadership positions, and a similar proportion, 74%, think women are doing better at getting well-paying jobs. 2 in 3 Americans believe that women are doing better when it comes to getting into college, yet women still earn less than men. That, again, is out of Pew Research, this time from a 2025 survey. The gains in workforce participation have not completely eliminated the pay gap, and there's a difference by age. In 2024, women earned an average of 85% of what men earned. And when it comes to perceptions of who should stay at home and take care of the families, let's take a look at some data spanning the decades. According to Gallup, 25 years ago in 2001, that Gallup poll said that only 13% that the ideal was for both parents to work full-time outside of the home. Meanwhile, 41% of Americans said one parent should stay home solely to raise the children. Now, traditional gender roles were still evident. 43% thought mom should be at home, with only 1% saying that dad should be the stay-at-home parent. 10 years earlier, in 1991, a little more than 6 in 10 Americans had said that mom should stay at home. And so let me stop there and bring in you, Barb, with a question, which is why, if women have made these advances in the workforce, why do these perceptions of traditional gender roles still persist?
Well, we have come a long way. And so I don't want to suggest that that has not been the case. But I think part of the issue is that it's thought of as being more of a choice. And at least initially that women wanted to have other roles. They wanted to have other professional careers. And those things were denied because of gender. But, over the decades, that has significantly changed. But what hasn't changed, I think, is the other issue where many families, both parents, need to work. Or most adults in the household need to work. I mean, if you think about what has happened to the cost of housing, regardless of whether you've dreamed to own or you have to rent, housing costs have skyrocketed. Grocery prices have gone through the roof. It's very hard to make ends meet for necessities like housing, food, healthcare, education. So I think that, part of this discussion was certainly, driven by an interest of many women to want to be able to be thought of beyond, just a wife and a mother, in a household. But the reality of it is that it's not a choice for most people. It is an economic necessity. And I think that's where the tension really results.
I just want to jump in, Lee, and bring in one more piece of data, again from Pew Research. In 1975, 31% of couples who had kids had 2 full-time working parents. By 2025, just last year, that had risen to 52%. And Barb, I think that the economics underscoring all of this does have a lot to do with it. But Lee, I know you wanted to jump in and provide your perspective.
I think during my lifetime, certainly, there's been a huge change in the role and in the behavior and the composition of the family in terms of who was working. I mean, when I was in college in the late 60s and early 70s, married women could not get a credit card without the husband's approval.
Hasn't that changed?
Oh, sure. I'm not going to go there, but let's just say it's changed. Okay, and we'll leave it at that. But I would say that the image of success from the 1950s, so the growth of suburbia, the two-car garage, the kids having televisions and all that. I mean, that image that we saw on television was kind of like the goal, but it really wasn't attainable in terms of the livelihood and what who was bringing in. And the question is whether it's one breadwinner or two. And obviously two became necessity. And just, the cost of living and achieving those kinds of idealized versions of what success was required more than that. So, the nature of the work has changed. And as was indicated in the opening earlier, people are doing different things. Women are now allowed and expected to do different things, and they certainly have the drive and the ambition to do so. So I think that's a big change. I recall earlier in the women's movement, I forget what the figure was of what percentage a woman made of a man in the workplace. I think it was in 60%, 70s. Now it's much higher than that, as you indicated in the numbers.
Also, I think the change in wages has been quite significant. And when Leah's talking about the beginning of women in the workforce in full force during the 1970s, and when many of the laws changed for banking and loans and a whole host of other institutional structures that basically determined women's place in society. So it wasn't just cultural, it was institutional. And so as we have seen those changes, understand that we have seen dramatic changes in wages and how much the hourly wage can sustain a family of four over this time. During the 70s, we saw the transition from very stable manufacturing jobs to a retail economy. And we weren't calling it disruption and we weren't calling it, a revolution. It was for many families because those incomes did not really exist. We've seen that also in the difference between the wages of workers and, management and CEOs. And so we've seen that widening gap, and I think that has all contributed to this issue. I think one of the things, though, that we also do find is that when you say choice, Mary, I think, it is sometimes a choice for families. Like sometimes a woman is the higher breadwinner. Sometimes, one partner or another partner wants to be the one that stays at home. And, if they want to change their lifestyle and kind of not get into that keeping up with the Joneses is all the assumption that many of us fall into, there are lifestyle choices that can be made. But I think one of the things that we are seeing, too, as we kind of move to more disruption is that there's a sense that women somehow have been given an extra benefit. In other words, they've been given a leg up. The quotas and laws that have protected gender equality have now been upended and are now causing gender inequality for men. So, yes, I think it's cultural. I think it's economic. I don't think the issues go away. And to a certain degree, I think it is inspiring and very helpful if people can get to the point where they are making a choice to work, to have a career, to have a profession, to be doing what it is they want to do. But that's not necessarily the case.
Well, I think also, Barbara, just to rephrase the question, and perhaps I can retract my is it a choice question, is really because I do agree it's not a choice. I'm a working mom, a family of 5. And, it is a choice in terms of what the trade-offs are, as you both pointed out. However, what I should have raised is this idea of judgment for women in the workforce who do have families and how they're perceived, because there are a lot of judgy people, for lack of a better term, out there who, if you choose to have a family and you choose to work, they feel that you're letting down your family. And yet, I don't think that perception necessarily exists for dads out there, or maybe they do. But I think that what it comes down to, whether families have the opportunity to make the choice, to have the trade-offs, that if they can do it, let everyone make their own choice for what is best for him, her, or them. Because really, there are sacrifices that people make on both ends. And just to the point about culture, I mentioned earlier this trad wife culture, which has been this rise, especially on social media, of women adopting more traditional gender roles in relation to family. And what one large criticism of this is that many of these social media feeds and accounts are monetized. And so really when they're saying that necessarily that they're not working, that they're there at home, taking care of the family and raising the kids and playing with the kids and supporting their husband. In fact, they're putting in a great deal of work, recording these videos, cutting the videos, promoting the videos and getting them up and out there and raising money with those videos. So, I think when we talk about what's going on in culture, specifically in social media culture, we need to be a little bit more critical about what's really going on behind the scenes.
You mentioned judgy people, Mary. I think that's a whole nother segment. It actually may be a couple of shows.
So let me bring in Cassidy and Molly, who are the next generation, possibly, of women in the workforce. When you hear all this historical context, Cassie, let me start with you. What are your thoughts as you think about your career path?
Well, I grew up with a mom who worked amazingly. She was so successful. She was always on the phone if she was working from home or she was in the office. So I grew up knowing that women can work and they can work hard. So I never thought about not working. And now that I really love what I'm doing, I'm excited to work. And there's really no part of me that sees myself not working unless it was like a maternity leave or any type of leave in general. I'm excited to see my work as a graphic designer. And it's crazy to me that at one point women didn't have that freedom and didn't have the freedom to love what they did. So I'm glad that I was born in this time.
And what about you, Molly?
I agree. My mom also has worked my whole entire life. So watching her work, I feel like I would be bored if I was home not really working. I'm interested in my career and new things.
So there was a time in American history, and I remember this. I had to register for the draft when I turned 18 in 1980. There you go. Now you can figure out how old I am. And it was some years since the Vietnam War, although I remember that still being waged. And I do remember registering for the draft, thinking, well, it's not going to mean anything because we don't go to war anymore. Since that time, Selective Service, which is what registering for the draft is, has kind of drifted out of the American consciousness. But it's still around. And we were reminded of that earlier this year when it was announced that at the end of this year, young men between the ages of 18 and 26, beginning in December, young men in America between 18 and 26 will be automatically registered in the Selective Service system. That replaces the current system where you've got to sign up by themselves. And they're probably still in post offices around the country. If you go to the post office, there's probably still the form that you fill out to register for Selective Service when you turn 18 years old. So what do Americans think about this? We asked a question in May in our own poll about this idea. And a majority of Americans, 53%, either strongly opposed this change. 46% strongly supported or supported it. So a pretty close split there. And there was a partisan difference. 69% of Democrats and 52% of the independents were opposed to this or strongly opposed. 68% of Republicans supported it or strongly supported this idea of automatic registration. Let me do a little history, and then Lee, I'm just going to give it away. I'm going to start with you because you are the only person on this podcast who qualified and had to register for the draft when you could have been sent to an active war zone. And I think that makes a big difference. So according to Gallup in 2017, knowing that the U.S. ended the military draft in 1973, they did kind of a historical look. In 1977, 54% of Americans favored keeping the all-volunteer military. Now remember, this is only 4 years after the draft had ended. A few years later, in 1980, two different Gallup surveys found majorities favored bringing back the military draft. And we can talk about what happened in 1980 that might have encouraged that sentiment. In 1981, 71% supported requiring 1 year of military or non-military national service for young men. And here's a twist, 54% supported requiring the same service for young women. They started asking this question. Support was lower among adults under 30, perhaps not surprising. 60% supported some sort of mandatory service for young men and 48% for young women. Public opinion later has moved strongly against reinstating the draft. Across Gallup polls conducted from 1998 to 2007, between 69% and 85% opposed returning to a military draft. So different thing between mandatory service, which Democrats and Republicans of various stripes and various presidents have proposed. AmeriCorps actually happened, but it wasn't mandatory. And then military draft. Lee, 1973, the draft ended. But you, in an earlier era, a couple of years before that, with the Vietnam War raging, had to register for the draft, and you had a draft number. Tell us about that.
So there was a lottery, which young men paid a whole bunch of attention to because of what was the possible result of what you got as a number. They put all the birth dates of the calendar into a lottery system, and you got a number. And my number happened to be 151, which is kind of like maybe good, maybe bad. I remember someone coming up to me and saying, "What was your number?" And I said 151. They said, "Bye-bye," which wasn't very encouraging at that time. The year that I was eligible, they went to the 125 that year, and they were doing it in blocks of 25. So I still had the difference of 150 and 151 as my cushion, but they only went to 125. But I know a lot of people who got very bad numbers because their birthday just happened to show up. And that was, things about, well, maybe I should go into the National Guard because I'm going to be drafted. There were student deferments, and part of the divisiveness over Vietnam had to do with the fact that students could use a deferment, and if you weren't in college, you were eligible for the draft, which, has all kinds of equity issues and created all kinds of rifts beyond just whether the war was good or not and we favored it or not. And then I graduated high school, and I graduated college, that was 1973. And the draft ended, and when I would have gone to graduate school and have been eligible then, had my number come up that year. So I had a little bit of a cushion, but it was very tense. And, I tell my students in class to give a sense of the length of this period, that we started to escalate and bomb North Vietnam when I was in 8th grade. And the war actually ended when I was in graduate school. So throughout my high school and 4 college years, this was sort of a cloud that you never felt was going to end because it was, part of your life for a long, long time. And fortunately, it did end, and we moved on as a nation. But now this thing is going to be somewhat controversial. And the question I had to ask was, and I want to make sure I understood this, it is an automatic registration for young men?
Men. Yeah.
Men.
And so
how does that work out in light of our previous discussion about women in the workforce?
Well, also, and Barb,
it seems kind of...
Yeah, Barb, that's what I want to ask is the military is no longer men only, despite what Pete Hegseth wants to do. Women are in the military. Women are generals and admirals. And so
have earned those positions.
And have earned those positions.
Yeah.
Is it unfair to men or to women, however you want to define it, that if we're going to have automatic registration and selective service, that women shouldn't be part of that?
Absolutely. And I do agree that women should be part of that selective service. There are a whole host of deferments, as Lee pointed out. It's not that, everyone is forced to go to war. I mean, if we look at other countries, I think particularly of Israel, who has always had both men and women in their military since their inception in 1948. And so I think if there's an argument that, women can serve, and we have witnessed that they can not only serve, but they can serve well, they can serve competently, and they can excel and be exceptional. So I don't really see why women should be excluded for the selective service. Obviously, there are requirements for going to war. And so both for men and women, there can be deferments. But I think that that's something that at this point in time, we should have already figured out. Granted, right now, I think the intention is that a very traditional perspective of the military and a very traditional perspective of women's roles, and I think not to be part of that is very significant. I mean, one other thing I did want to point out is that when we were reviewing the surveys and the public opinion over time on this issue, we get very different results when we ask about either military service or public service or the draft itself. So once we call the selective service the draft, meaning that you may have to do something that you would prefer not to do and would rather go in a very different direction, as opposed to something where you are required to have some kind of military or public service, community service, we get very different answers of what people believe should happen. And I think everybody is for young people, doing something for their country in one form or another. There is strong support for either military or non-military service, but some kind of requirement for young people to have in order to be, rightful citizens, of the country as there are in other places around the world. But that is, certainly those who oppose the draft will call it the draft. Those who support it will likely call it a selective service or military service. And so, kind of buyer beware on the public opinion side as these numbers get thrown around, because I think it will very much be noticed in 2027. And if we continue to have these hotspots around the world, can certainly become an issue in 2028 as well.
I can't imagine that there isn't a lawsuit. Now, this is just registering for the draft. It's not actually being drafted. However, I can't imagine that there won't be some fella who says, I'm being discriminated against. This should not just be men.
Well, wait a second. When you said a lawsuit, I thought you meant the lawsuit from the other side.
Yeah, what are they suing?
Because I think
we should have a right to
absolutely.
Well, there you go.
Absolutely.
So during my generation, it was whether you were in college or not. Okay, but here it's sort of, what is your gender?
Yeah, this gender thing is interesting. Also, Barb, I think your point is really well taken about draft versus selective service. ABC News and Ipsos did a poll about the same time we did in April of 2026. It was released in May. 85% of Americans are opposed to bringing back the draft. Very different numbers than we found when we asked about selective service. And that's across the board. I mean, there's virtually no change across party, very little change across age groups or anything like that. If you say draft, Americans are opposed to that. And I don't think that there's nobody talking about ending the all volunteer military. So it's to call it the military draft, that its requirement, I think is a bit misleading, but it does very effectively put the public against it. I am curious though. We have had lots of presidents talk about mandatory service, and we have had programs where there was service. AmeriCorps is probably the most recent and best example. Kennedy, obviously, in the 60s, there was the Peace Corps as well as the draft. Is there a place now, after all of these years in American history and how we are now as a country, do you think there's a place, or either of you think there's a place for a candidate to say mandatory service for maybe 1 year? Is that something that could rally anybody right now? Is that something that could bring us together? Is that a good thing, a good campaign idea?
Are you going to get paid for your year of service?
Yeah, no. I mean, you get paid in the military, yeah.
Well, I think the numbers actually suggest that there would be a great deal of support, because there is significant public opinion for service and for service to the country. And I think particularly this generation now, they want to make a difference. They don't want to be drafted into making that difference. But I think if it was something that was across the board, that did have deferments for special cases, I think that would be something that would be very beneficial to bringing the country together, because I think that is a value that both sides, as we often describe them, have. And I think it's something we can all agree on.
So what we've got now for the fun fact is sort of a continuation of our discussion last time. We're turning the clock back to 1949, before my time, as I said last week. I want to make sure everybody gets that. The question was, and this is, I think, a really interesting discussion we're going to have. What's the best way you yourself have found to keep cool during these hot summer days? Now, recognize that this is pre-air conditioning. There is a time in our history, in the civilization that we are, that there were not air conditioners in buildings, and you didn't walk into lobbies and cool off. You didn't go sleep in air conditioning in your house. You didn't have central air conditioning, let alone window air conditioners. You had maybe a fan or a window to open. And
is this when dinosaurs roamed the earth, Lee? I'm just trying to...
They became extinct. It was really
because it was so hot, of course.
It was so hot. How hot was it? Okay, so here's what the national audience said in 1949. First of all, 11% right off the bat said, I can't find a way to keep cool in the summer. Take it out. I'm not doing it. And then the options are going to sound really like Middle Ages. So one is 27%, find a cool location, like go to the shade, avoid the sun, get away from the city. I know of people who used to go to the mountains because there was coolness in the mountains, like in New York, the Catskills. You took off and you headed to get a cooler place. That's 27%. 22% said, and this is pretty comical, I think, relax, take it easy, keep quiet. In other words, don't do a
Like
lot.
that's an option.
Don't
like
move.
slow it down, because else you're going to be, in a bucket of sweat. I don't know what it is. Anyway, so that's 22%, 14%. Again, don't think about it. Stay occupied with your work. It's not hot. It's not 108 degrees. My friends, the Sparks, reported that Dallas was 108 degrees yesterday. Cool it. Don't worry about things because it's going to feel hotter if you start really getting uptight. 11%, go swimming, take a shower, get a water hose. 9%, drink beverages. Okay. And not much else there. Beverages. Some people say eat less. I looked up some of the information around this, and I found that it was very interesting. It's at this time, if you recall, a place called Montgomery Ward's, which sold lots of stuff, appliances and all kinds of things for the household, and sort of like a Home Depot of an earlier era. And what they were saying was, we're going to sell you awnings, and you're going to put an awning on your house. And basically, you can now find the shade, and that's going to keep you cool in the summer. Awnings.
Not a bad idea.
Anyway.
Still works.
Yeah, not a
still
bad
effective.
idea.
I mean,
Not a bad idea. I remember when I was a kid growing up in pre-air conditioning era, and I'd go to Brooklyn, New York to visit my grandparents. We finally got them to put in a window fan. I mean, it was hot in the summer. And then they had a little bedroom, which they said always had a breeze in the little bedroom. I never found a breeze in the little bedroom. I still loved my grandparents, but they were not being straight with me about that. So I'm curious, how do you guys react to this? This is like the Middle Ages, right?
Yeah, you can bring in any of the youngsters because in 1949 though, I think I did a little research on air conditioning as well, and we were right on the precipice of suburbia getting window air conditioners in the 1950s. But that certainly was a long way off for those who were suffering through long, hot summers in 1949. And as you mentioned, Lee, central air conditioning was still decades off. So things have changed incredibly. In fact, I agree with you. When I looked at the list of things people would do to cool off, I kind of got confused because I hadn't looked at the date of the survey prior to looking at the list of choices.
Who are
And I
these
was
people?
like,
What
well,
are they doing?
why don't you just go inside? And, look, there's a lot of things that have changed because we can go inside. And the fact that I think a lot of the southern states and southwestern states have become incredibly populated since 1949. And if you look at the migration of population over that time, you will see a very significant impact of air conditioning.
Mary, what's it like in Queens, New York, when it's really, you kids go out and play baseball?
You head to the
in heat?
Catskills?
I would go to Pennsylvania as a kid. But fun fact is that when I was younger, my parents only had an air conditioner in their room because my dad could not handle the heat well for health issues. But we did live on Jamaica Bay and next to my great aunt and my great uncle. And the big joke was that they actually firmly believed this, that if you kept the windows open toward the street and then the back windows on the porch by the water, you'd get cross ventilation. And I was always waiting, like Lee said, about waiting for the breeze in the one room in his grandparents' house, his grandmother's apartment, that I was always waiting for the breeze. It was a good thing we did have a pool, so that did help us keep cool, but I would not give up my air conditioner for anything these days.
Yeah. Jay, when did you guys get air conditioning in your house?
So I was born in California, and in Southern California, there was no air conditioning in any houses because it didn't get that hot. In the desert, it probably did. We lived down at the beach, so there's no air conditioning. We moved to Connecticut, and there were window air conditioners, and I didn't know what it was. I mean, I wasn't like a baby. I didn't know how to use it. So we had them there. What's interesting is we don't have air conditioning in our house now. We live up in Columbia County, and there are a few days a year when you need it, but we do what my husband calls New England air conditioning. He is not from New England. I don't know where he came up with this, but it is what you do. At night, it's cool. It's in the 50s. Even when it's in the 90s in the day, it gets down to the 50s. We're up, high up, and you open everything, and then you shut it first thing in the morning, and you close the curtains. You come live in the dark. And sure enough, it keeps the house cool all day, even when it gets really hot outside. And that keeps us from having to have air conditioning. Now, to be fair, we built a garage that has a studio and an office and some other stuff, and we put in a heat pump. Because we had to heat it, but we figured we probably should have one building we could go to because it is getting hotter. And when you used to be able to get away with not having air conditioning up where we are in Columbia County, fewer and fewer people try and do that. And so I think air conditioning is not optional as they're discovering in Europe now. Air conditioning is probably no longer optional in a lot of places it used to be.
I'm going to turn to Cassidy, AJ, and Molly, and I want to know, is this discussion like my great-great-great-great-grandparents discussing the Civil War in Gettysburg? I mean, what are we talking here? Are you thinking like, how did we ever survive? A fan? I mean, hello. Is this like total fiction for you guys?
Yeah, pretty much. I would say the only time I experience no air conditioning is a freshman year dorm, or if a car, it does not have an air conditioning actively working. Every other time, it's pretty good. I would say maybe there are some vacation houses like down the shore where they don't provide an air conditioning, but other than that, I'm living in the cool. I hate being hot. I would never purposely be hot.
Yeah, I love the air conditioning. Can't get cold enough for me.
So,
AJ.
So wait.
Sorry,
So Cassidy, the idea that in this survey, some people said the best way to deal with the heat is just to not think about it. That's not one of your options.
No, absolutely
Yeah, okay.
not. I hate being hot so much. And call back to the last podcast with ideal room temperatures. It should be colder so you can make yourself warmer. But I digress.
I used to hate the heat also in the summer.
My husband says that.
My mother used to take me to Howard Johnson's, I remember, which was air conditioned, to just get some relief from the heat because I would not eat or I was just miserable. AJ, how's life in AJville?
It's called Long Island, Lee. Long Island.
Yeah, I need the AC too. I would say the one time I didn't have AC was when I was abroad in Florence. They don't have AC there, so that was hot. Especially when I first got there in August, it was maybe the hottest I've ever been. It was very miserable.
What was that like though? Because basically your experience in Florence is what we're talking about here, which is America pre-air conditioning. Did you do what they suggest, what Americans said in 1949 they did, which is to find some shade or to get in a veranda or drink something cool? What'd you do?
Lots of water and sweating and kept the windows open a lot. I don't know. It was
And
tough.
did you take a very long lunch?
Yes. Oh, yeah, always. I always do.
Molly, yeah, what do you
Yeah, I hate
buy into in this discussion?
I can't imagine not being in air conditioning. I need it to think even. So yeah, I don't know how people did it back then. I would probably stay up in the mountains or something or go swimming.
And, a lot of people do it today. I mean, we do feel that air conditioning is ubiquitous, but there are a lot of folks who do have to work outdoors.
Outside, yeah.
During both the summer months and the winter months where the temperature gets turned way down. Yeah, I mean, it is still an issue, but I do wonder if we do adapt to our environments and our surroundings to a certain degree. But I agree, hot is hot and cold is cold.
Yeah, but you feel like we could tolerate it better before we had the option. I think so, but I think that may be fiction as well. We just probably didn't talk about it.
You never felt that breeze in the little bedroom, Lee.
Never felt it. I looked, never was. I would end this week's podcast with a slightly different ending. Our friend Spence, who some of you know, told us this week that he found our podcast and he was listening to it. And get this, he binge listening. He did 3 podcasts in a row. Spence, I respect you enormously, but hello, get a life. 3
That's
podcasts.
how he deals with the heat, Lee. That wasn't one of the answers on the poll, but that's it.
Anyway, that's it for this week. Stay cool, everybody, including our friends in Dallas with their 108-degree temperature. Anyway, have a great week, folks, and we'll catch up with you next week.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Merit Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes AJ Gambino, Tommy Rogers,
Cassie Connors, and Molly Goodger.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button. Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll
See you next time.